Aloha and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the class interface. We've dealt with the class interface in the past, we just haven't really talked about it. So what is the class interface? The class interface is simply the list of methods, functions that you can access through the object. So they give you an interface into the class. So we're going to go ahead and pull up VS Code, and I'm going to show you a function that I've shown you in the past. And that is dir. So dir gives you kind of like a directory of all the things that a type can do, or a class can do. So if I run this, I'm going to get this list of all these functions that are associated with strings. So I can use these functions. I can go down here and say, let's take a string hello, and then I can do something like is space that we see down there. And this is this is part of the class interface. So the class interface, this is all the things that are in that we can do to it. So I can run that, and oh yay, it's not false. Okay, we can also run these dunder ones. We should not run them, but we can. So this is really interesting because the dunders are really meant to be what we call private functions. And a private function is something that's meant to be available inside the class, but not outside. In other words, me as a user, I can create something of, let's say, a string type. I can create a string, but it doesn't want me using those dunder functions because that's doing something, inside internally. And they don't want you to really necessarily worry about that stuff. Plus, you can mess things up. So they have these dunder functions in here, and in general, just leave them alone. In other languages, we call that the dunder functions, we call them private functions. They're functions that aren't really available for the common user to use. They're just used internally. Unfortunately, Python is really lax about that, and you can call in these dunder functions, and you can really mess yourself up if you want. So I would avoid trying to call these dunder functions. Just look at the other ones, and that's really the class interface that you want to be using here. So keep that in mind. The dunder functions, we commonly use dunder functions when we're going to make something internally, as I mentioned. Don't access them directly. You can still use it, but it's just not a good idea. You can also use classes to implement the abstract data type. We saw that earlier in a lesson. We didn't really get into it, but abstract data types get into this concept of creating a high-level object of something. Let's say a person. We've done people in the past. So we create this high-level concept of like a person, and then we define the class interface. We tell the user, hey, you can do these things on a, with a person. You can sit, you can walk, you can talk. These are the functions that you can use with this abstract data type of a person. But when it comes down to actually implementing that, you do that on the inside. So in programming, we have this concept of separating out your interface from the implementation. And it makes it easier for development because from a user's perspective, what that function does, you don't care about. You just need that when you call on it, it does what you expect it to. On the other side, your developers can make changes to it. They can do all kinds of things to make it more efficient. They can do things that improve it in different ways, but that's going to be invisible to the user. The user doesn't have to, the user of that class doesn't have to know any of that. All they have to know is these are the functions I can call, and when I call on these functions, it does as I expect it to. And you leave everything else at the implementation level to the developers. So that's the concept of separating out your interface from your implementation. It's done that way using things like hidden, the idea of hidden functions, your dunder functions in here, your quote unquote private functions. So that's how you build an abstract data type. You define your class interface, the methods and the functions that you want your user to be able to call on, And then you just do that on the back end with your developers and let them, handle the implementation side of it. So the user only has access to these high level concepts like walk, talk, sit, whatever, and everything else, the low level details, the nitty gritty, it's all done internally. And we do that through hiding all the details of it. We publicly, give the class interface, you use that, and all the rest, we just hide it from the user so they don't have to worry about anything. So that's it for the class interface. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask. I would highly recommend at this point that you pull out the interpreter for Python or use something like VS Code and play around with it and kind of use this dir function to figure out what types of things you can do on different types. It's really fascinating. And then it's also neat to see what kind of dunder functions you have in there and try to figure out what they do. And it's all in there. Whack away at it. There's nothing you can break. So play around with it, try to figure things out, and get a better understanding of it. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in email, and we can set up a Zoom meeting if you like. So until then, I'll see you in the next lesson.